3, 2, grabamos.
Thank you very much for coming to talk in Hugoni again.
Sure, of
Jonathan.
course.
I was curious, what made you interested in organizational change and individual change? Why do you focus on this subject?
A combination of things. First, I had worked for a big corporation in the US, and I saw how complicated it could be. And then secondly, I really like complicated things. And it's a field that's still evolving, so I find that really interesting. So it is complex, it involves systems and people, and so I really enjoy that mixture. And it's so important.
Yes, and what would you say the differences and similarities between the change in an individual and the change in an organization?
Sure. Well, I think that you don't get organizational change without personal change. And personal change is already hard enough. So if you're trying to lose weight, for example, or you're trying to learn to delegate more, that can be quite difficult if you're not already doing it. And then in an organization, you have to have different levels of folks usually who are trying to come to terms with why they haven't changed already and what's keeping them stuck. And usually, I mean, it would be wonderful if it were just this one little thing they didn't understand or know yet, but usually it's more complicated than that.
And how do you get behind people? How do you help people identify what it is that got them stuck?
Sure. So we look at what they're doing that is in terms of behaviors. So really drilling down into what's keeping them from changing. So for example, if you're trying to get people to delegate more, what are you doing instead of delegating? And then we have them think about, or I have them think about, what would happen if they didn't do that? So what's keeping them from doing that? And so they can get to some of their worries and fears and concerns that make it make sense that they're not doing it. So for example, with delegating, if you are worried you won't be the smartest person in the room, and then you'll end up getting fired, or you worry that they won't do a good job, and so people will think you're a bad leader and you'll get fired. Usually there's some, even if it's out of awareness, some really bad consequence that's in here somewhere that's making it seem really risky to change.
Yes. And what would be this link between individual change and organizational change? Can you give us an example of how individual change becomes organizational change? So for example, your example of delegation,
right.
What impact has that got in the organization?
Sure. So for example, if you looked around the organization and you saw at a certain level, people are not delegating as much as they are, in addition to why each individual isn't changing, you might look at how as an organization are we helping people not to delegate. For example, there are lots of organizations where they say we need to take big chances. Mm-hmm. And when you look at bonuses and how people move up, actually these supposedly safe risks turn out not to be very safe at all. Mm-hmm. So as you look more structurally, what are we doing as an organization that's getting in the way of change, and why are we doing that? Then you get them back to the personal and say, and what are we going to do about that?
Mm-hmm. And what are other complexities of achieving organizational change other than these barriers to personal change? What other barriers have you found?
Well, I think any system, when you start to impact it, there's often a lot of momentum behind where they've been, and so it pulls it back to the old way. So unless you're really making enough of a shift, not because somebody said so, but because it really makes sense at all levels, you may change for a short while, just as people might lose weight for a while, but then start to eat the way they used to. An organization might say, okay, now we're going to work on diversity, and that lasts for just a short while, and then comes back to the old way because they haven't really dealt with why they weren't diverse in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that when that happens, people stop believing that it's possible to change.
Well, see, that's one of the big issues is if you try to have a big project to create change and it fails, then people can lose faith not just in that effort, but in all efforts. You know, especially if senior management appears to back away from the work and say, oh, let's go back to our old ways, then people are going to say, okay, the next time you try to change, we'll just wait it out. So that is a risk.
And so how do you achieve sustainable change in an organization?
Sure. I think you have to really look at what is keeping the system in place. And, you know, from a systemic perspective, from an individual perspective, and not change too fast before having really examined, oh, the way we're doing it doesn't make sense anymore. Once you really truly believe that, and enough people in the organization believe that, it's much easier to move forward. But if people are just going along for show, and especially if from the top down people aren't really checking to see, are you really on board with this? If you're not on board, why not? We need to understand it. If you don't ask those questions, then you'll get people who will just yes you and say, go ahead, we'll see what happens, and you're probably doomed to failure.
And how do you do that on a large scale? If you say it's a question of getting critical mass,
Sure.
Are those conversations that start becoming part of, or how does that?
Yeah, I think so. What I work with often is people are just not curious enough. And so if from the top down, if you're asking questions and not just assuming that when people nod, everything's okay, and that's not that complex an idea. And then you can pass it down and expect other people to be curious as well and create a culture of curiosity. You know, why are we doing this? What's the downside of doing this new thing that we think would make sense? If you can have a culture where it's okay to ask those questions and expected that you ask those questions, then I think you're really on a different track.
And you mentioned at some point
Ahí puede ser
la pausa.
la